Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we're so grateful that you can join us today. As you might imagine, today we're going to cover a lot of different topics. First half hour, I'm going to just spend some time working our way through a couple of issues in the news. Also looking back to one of the articles we posted yesterday, which we really never had a chance to talk about. Then in about a half an hour, we're going to be talking about this whole idea of a free will defense. You have heard many times people say, look, why couldn't God have created a world? If indeed you believe in a God and there's evil in the world, God would certainly be all powerful and be able to destroy evil. God is all loving and would want to destroy evil. And yet you say that there is a good God and yet there's evil in the world. And the response, oftentimes from us that do apologetics or give answers, is what's called the free will defense. As soon as God gave us as human beings a free will, that's a will to choose him or to reject him, an opportunity to choose good or to choose evil, then immediately you have the possibility of evil coming into the world. And of course, we can get into some more of the details, but I thought Dolores Morris does a very good job. Dr. Morris can help us through some of that, and so we'll spend some time with her, just to maybe again giving you another tool for your apologetics toolbox. Then, next hour, we will be talking with two individuals, Ryan Sanders and David French. Both of them have published articles recently about this idea of Christian nationalism. It's a topic we've addressed before. But I thought when you have two individuals coming out with articles almost the same week, and then since then there have been subsequent follow-up articles by David French in the Dispatch. We've posted a few and want to have a discussion about that as well. It relates very much as well to the fact that our most recent booklet coming out to you is entitled A Biblical Point of View on Church State. So if you are a donor, you'll be seeing that in the mail pretty soon. So there are a lot of reasons to cover that. But let's go back to, of course, the hostage situation over the weekend. And we posted an article yesterday, which, of course, I didn't have a chance to get to because we had so many great interviews. And that is a piece by David Harsanyi in which he says, The Texas Synagogue Hostage Crisis, a Case Study in Downplaying Anti-Semitism. The story, as you well know, is you have this 44-year-old individual, Muslim, Malik Fasil Akram. And interestingly enough, the attempt by the mainstream media to play it down, because by the time you get to even, I guess, it's the second paragraph, David reminds us that the Telegraph described him as a man with an English accent. He's Muslim, but no, we don't want to talk about that. He is attacking a synagogue, but we are really strangely confused as to why he would choose a synagogue. It must have been just random, because there couldn't possibly be any reason why an individual who is Muslim, who is actually coming out with all sorts of anti-Semitic statements, would possibly choose a synagogue. And so again, this piece, which it was in yesterday, but you can go to the website, pointofview.net, and then type in, or just type in the word anti-Semitism, or on the site navigation, if you pull it down, there's a thing called shows, and that will then take you to yesterday's show, and you'll find the article. So it's easy to find. Of course, you can use the search engine. But he points out that near the end, he says you can't really blame some Jews for being perturbed at the FBI recently charged with keeping an eye on domestic terrorists who challenged school board members for initially contending that the Texas synagogue attack was not specifically related to the Jewish community. The point they're making is right now we have a domestic terrorism unit that has been established by the Justice Department, and the head of the Justice Department be the Attorney General, who a while back in a letter suggested that some of these parents that have maybe gotten out of hand, albeit willing to admit that, at school board meetings could be labeled as domestic terrorists. So we talk about that. We have groups focusing on that, but when you talk about the whole issue of whether or not there is actually any kind of connection between a Muslim spouting all sorts of anti-Semitic thoughts and the fact that he attacked a synagogue in the area of Dallas-Fort Worth because he wanted to free an individual who is incarcerated in Fort Worth. The inability to see the connection, I think, is starting to bother a lot of Jewish people. And you might remember on Monday I did talk a little bit about what Barry Weiss, who again, a liberal, not somebody who would necessarily agree with many things we talk about on the table here, but nevertheless was also expressing just the complete frustration about this issue. And of course, we have produced a booklet. I'll hold it up again in case you're not familiar, on the subject of anti-Semitism. I think it is a big issue, and it is illustrated by the last paragraph of this piece, because he says, in the historic harmony of American life, there are more anti-Jewish crimes perpetuated than all the other religious motivated crimes combined, often at the hands of other minorities. And the habit of downplaying this kind of anti-Semitism or appropriating it for partisanship is a dangerous game. I'll go one step further. David says, of course, these are as much as though all the other religiously motivated behind. If you look at our booklet, or again, I'll update it because now it's been a year or two, so we'll see if the numbers are any different, but I doubt it, that the last time I looked at this, a majority, that would be more than 50% for those of you that are liberals, that would be more than 50% of individuals that were actually listed as a hate crime. These were anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish crimes. So again, I think there is a point to be made about the fact that whenever it doesn't fit the narrative of the media, they downplay it. And again, this man is obviously disturbed. Of course, he's no longer alive. There are all sorts of other issues going on in his life, but to not acknowledge that most of that probably was motivated with a very definite anti-Semitic bias, I think was missing something. So, and we need to take a break, but when we come back from the break, I want to talk about a couple of individuals that have found themselves sort of in the crosshairs. And a way to illustrate this before we get to it is that sometimes once an institution, and this would be a media institution, determines that you're on one side or the other, then all of a sudden all sorts of articles begin to surface that in many cases were actually mentioned rarely, if at all, because of that. And a good example of that is just the other day, the National Review, the editors of the National Review published a piece called Fauci Must Go. That's Dr. Anthony Fauci. Now, in their piece, they're very quick to acknowledge that sometimes he has been subjected to unfair attacks by various individuals, but they also go through this long litany of reasons why this individual, maybe it is definitely time to go, maybe past time to go. Well, that came out a day or two ago. Not to be outdone, the next day there's a piece, Fauci's Manufactured Public Health Consensus. Oh, my goodness, that's something we've been talking about for some time, because the people that said, no, we are sure that the virus did not come from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Well, yeah, the people that came back and defended him, and even in many cases defended the fact that this must have been natural, themselves were actually receiving funds from the Dr. Anthony Fauci's organization and federal organization. So that one, and another individual that has told us that most people don't care about the Uyghurs. We'll get into that as well. And you're starting to see some things turn on some of these very prominent individuals. We'll talk about that right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This country had a crime spike in 2021. The only real question is whether it will continue in 2022. Social commentators remind us that once law and order is lost, it is not easy to restore. How bad was this crime spike? The Uniform Crime Report details a rise in murders of around 29%. A dozen U.S. cities set homicide records: Tucson, Arizona; Columbus, Ohio; Toledo, Ohio; Rochester, New York; Philadelphia, Pennsylvania; Indianapolis, Indiana; Louisville, Kentucky; St. Paul, Minnesota; Portland, Oregon; Baton Rouge, Louisiana; Austin, Texas; and Albuquerque, New Mexico. Some of these cities are a surprise, but Portland and St. Paul, Minnesota are not. These are places in the country where the city leaders called for defunding the police and then went ahead and did just that. Mayors in some of these cities who originally talked about defunding the police have now quietly decided to restore funding. Of course, homicide isn't the only crime statistic on the way up. YouTube is full of videos of criminals breaking into stores and running off with stolen goods. Some of the videos show criminals in stores casually walking through the store, picking up items and walking out. Store owners have tried to stop this rash of smash and grab by posting security, but you can see videos where they don't try too hard to stop the pillaging since they don't want to get hurt. Law enforcement is also experiencing what has been called the Minneapolis effect. Proactive policing is declining because so many of the anti-police protests. Arrests are down and crime went up. As much as we would hope 2022 would be better than 2021, these trends won't be easily reversed. We may see a continued crime wave before it can be stopped. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, just for a few more minutes, and then we're going to spend some time in the last half hour of this program talking about the Freewill Defense and how we can maybe answer some of the questions that people have about the existence of God and yet the presence of evil. But just before we do so, let me again talk about two individuals that we're going to talk about. Of course, I mentioned Anthony Fauci. In just a minute, we're going to talk about Chamath Palihapitiya, assuming I've said his name correctly. You may not know who he is, but we'll get into it in just a minute. And these are two individuals that up until now have been really favorably positioned in front of the press. Oh, yeah, there have been criticisms and all that. But it reminds me of the fact that sometimes to understand how an institution works, especially even in the media, think about how an individual works. That is, if you've had a friend that sometimes does something that you don't like, because he or she is a friend, you sometimes say, well, that's just Bob, that's just Sue, that's just the way they are. And then one day the light switch flips and you go, I don't really like him. I don't like what he's been doing. And all of a sudden, then all the negatives that you have sort of covered over begin to surface. And you've seen that over the last approximately 48 to 72 hours with Anthony Fauci. Now, does it mean everybody in the press is against him? No, but I use the National Review because they've been the most prominent, and I have seen some other comments as well. And so the editors of the National Review recently, this was just a day ago, published this piece. Of course, it was written the day before, and they said, it's past time for the public health policy in America to acknowledge that COVID-19 is an endemic disease, and for the most part, the risk to individuals to manage. Yet the problem, they point out, is Dr. Anthony Fauci stands in the way of executing that shift and communicating it to the public. And that's why they argue that, indeed, Dr. Anthony Fauci should be relieved of his duties at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. He, by the way, is the highest paid federal employee at the moment. They go on to say that Fauci's old behavior has undermined public trust in response to the pandemic. For example, by sitting for celebrity profiles and documentaries, by stifling public debate about the origins of COVID-19 and its proper response, by responding in lawyerly and evasive fashion to questions about the NIH research dollars, goes on and on and on. Of course, all the spats he's had with, of course, Senator Rand Paul. A little bit later in the article, they go on to say that it's been a long time ago that some of these things happened. And again, you can certainly admit that there have been, as this article points out, unfair attacks and even some deranged threats and conspiracy theories and all sorts of things about him. But he said, they go on to say, by his own admission, Anthony Fauci misleads the public. They go through the long list of ones that you've heard us talk about before, whether we're talking about masks or a number of other things. A little bit later, they talk about the fact that he was constantly shifting the goalpost on when herd immunity might be reached. And almost every time there was a possible, hey, I think we can probably open up so we can get together for Thanksgiving, there was Anthony Fauci wanting to close everything back down again. And so, nevertheless, the editors on their editorial simply say Fauci must go. Well, it has been interesting because once somebody starts saying that, everybody else starts saying, I've really had concerns about him as well. Jack Crow, for example, Fauci's manufactured public health consensus. All of a sudden, these things are surfacing, and we've been talking about this for the better part of a year, I suspect, because when there were questions about the way in which he and some other individuals tried to shut down the so-called lab leak theory, he fell back on a refrain in which he says the attacks are political, just more fodder for the anti-scientist partisans, and of course, obviously picking Senator Rand Paul as a person who's just out for a vendetta. I'm not sure that's true, but that's kind of the argument we have. But then they begin to go back through and say, now, wait a minute. The argument by Dr. Anthony Fauci is that the scientific community backs Anthony Fauci. Well, then Jack Crow and some of the others said, well, let's just go and look at all these individuals. And we had 84 professors, scientists, and researchers and public health administrators that signed this open letter. Okay, so far so good. So remember that number because we have 84. But of the 84, 74, in other words, all but 10 of them are affiliated with institutions that receive funding from the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases. In total, those institutions received $1.8 billion from Anthony Fauci's institution. Now, again, just because you receive money doesn't mean that you aren't biased or you are biased, but I thought was really striking that this particular valuation, which I think should have been in articles, wouldn't you think? New York Times, Washington Post, maybe even the Wall Street Journal, a variety of others. These are the kinds of things that are coming out right now. And I think it illustrates again that once the media begins to realize that there is a problem with a particular individual, and I'm starting to see this, of course, now with the President of the United States, it shows up as well. Let's just take one more because I did want to mention the fact that just the other day there was a firestorm over some of the comments being made by Chamath Palihapitiya, and he is an individual, was born in Sri Lanka. He's a venture capitalist, primarily listed from Canada, but also here in the United States, and he was making a statement, and I think you've probably seen it by now, that he really doesn't care about the Uyghurs in China. He was really expressing some kind of frustration that people keep bringing this up, whether we should be that concerned about China. And as one of the part owners of an NBA team, time, there has always been this tendency to just kind of push away any of the questions about China's human rights abuses. And the first attempt to try to explain away his comment was, well, this was, just an unintended comment. No, it was, and I'm so grateful for Jim Garrity digging this out. This was actually in a podcast with his own friends. So we're not talking about an ambush interview where you haven't been talking about this for some time. He specifically said that indeed he just didn't have any real concern about the plight of Uyghurs. These would be Muslims in China. And he said that that was indeed his stance. And he went on to say that the hard truth is that not only do I not care about it, but nobody cares about this. And of course, that led to all sorts of pushback saying, wait a minute, we care about this. We're concerned about this. And even if you go to our website right now, you can see we have download our fact sheet on boycotting the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. Now, I know that we're going to have athletes there. If you want to support the athletes, fine. But I think many of us are starting to say we don't have to encourage this. And one of the ways we could maybe discourage this whole issue is to just say, we're just not going to watch them. We wish that this was never scheduled in Beijing. We wish the administration did more than saying, well, we might have a diplomatic boycott or something like that. But we can't control that. But you can control whether or not you decide to watch that television program, watch those Olympics. And as much as I want to support those athletes, also don't want to support Beijing, China, and Communist Chinese Party. So, again, I just wanted you to illustrate again that here is somebody who has been kind of the darling of the press, Silicon Valley, venture capitalist, part owner of an NBA team, and all of a sudden, it just took a comment or two like that, and then for others to begin to realize that standing by him is probably not going to be in the best interest of the so-called establishment media. So we haven't said much about it, but it's an illustration, again, that sometimes you will overlook some of the problems of your friends, but there comes a point in time when maybe the light switch goes from light to dark, and all of a sudden, all these stories are starting to come out. Here's my prediction. We will see more of these in the next couple of days for these individuals and perhaps some others. And, of course, given the fact that the president's approval rating is as low as anything we've ever seen in a modern presidency, I suspect you're also going to see more and more people talking about, maybe he is just a little bit too old for the job. Maybe we made a mistake by putting him in that position. Maybe it's time for him to step down and let someone else run the country. Well, I'm sure see some more of those in the next couple of days. And it's a good illustration, again, how once somebody turns on you, especially the media, sometimes you never have a chance to get back. If you go to the website, I've been mentioning the download of our fact sheet. It's still available. It'll be up there for another day or two, and then we're going to move on. My Viewpoints commentary is upon this incredible crime spike, which I'd like to talk about, but maybe we'll get to that tomorrow. Our take action item, as you well know, is to save the filibuster. If you have not contacted your two United States senators, we make it real easy. And, of course, on Monday, we had this great interview with our friends Will Ford and Matt Lockett, and we posted the earlier interview that took place 2 years ago, in case you didn't have a chance to hear that. And of course, you can also watch or listen to the one that took place just a few days ago. Let's take a break. We're going to come back and talk about how to equip you to be a better apologist right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
You know, here on Point of View, we want you to know how to articulate a biblical worldview and also know how to defend a biblical worldview, which is why when I heard about this about a year and a half ago, I subscribed to the Worldview Bulletin. We had, of course, at that time, Dr. Paul Gould and Dr. Paul Copan on to talk about that. More recently, we had Paul on again, Paul Gould, I should say, again to talk about that. And so we really enjoyed the articles that are there, and I do commend it to you. I subscribe to it, so I'm asking you to do the same. We have information about that on the website, but there was a very good article by Dolores G. Morris, Dr. Morris, writing about the Freewill Defense. Now, to understand that, you know that perhaps one of the more perennial questions in this area of Christian defense and apologetics is the existence of a good and loving and all-powerful God and the existence of evil. Certainly an all-powerful God could destroy evil. An all-loving God would want to destroy evil, yet evil exists. So why is there even evil in the world? And more importantly, what does that mean in terms of how God would even allow that? And the answer oftentimes is if God gives us freedom, that is, we have a free will choice, we are free to choose him or to reject him. We're free to choose good or to choose evil. But I thought it would be very good to spend a little bit of time talking with an individual that you need to know more about, and that's Dr. Dolores Morris, who is the Associate Professor of Instruction in Philosophy at the University of South Florida there in Tampa, has her PhD in philosophy from the University of Notre Dame, individual that also works on the executive committee of the Society of Christian Philosophers. I might commend to you her first book, Believing Philosophy, Becoming a Christian Philosopher, and she joins us now by phone. So, Dr. Morris, thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
I might also mention you're working on a lot of the mind-brain kinds of issues, which we may have you back on that as well. Free choice, free will, artificial intelligence, all sorts of other things we're talking about. But first of all, in this piece, which we have made available, by the way, I might just mention we have a link to your website, DoloresGMorris.com. We have a link to your Twitter feed and your Facebook page. So that's where people can maybe contact you and have you come and speak. But the argument that is usually made, and help us out with this, is that if indeed God was going to create a world with free creatures, us, then we're free to actually perform good actions or evil actions, and that is a better world than one where we're not free at all. Can you help us out with this?
Yes, absolutely. So, the way that the problem of evil is often presented just in internet forums and casual places like that, is that the existence of God seems to be logically incompatible with the existence of evil. And the truth is that has been ruled out by academic philosophers who are atheists and theists. For 50 years now, no one has taken that very seriously because it seems clear that there's no contradiction in supposing that a loving God might allow evil. But the problem is how much evil and how much suffering, right? So the much more powerful argument that we call the problem of evil is what we might call the evidential argument, which just says, look, it looks like some of the evil in the world is just too much. It looks like there is gratuitous suffering that a God could have prevented, and it doesn't serve any greater good. The free will defense pushes back against that and just says, no, I don't think that any of this evil is gratuitous. But to address that, you have to explain why the evil is here in the first place. And then the most common answer that I would say you find in philosophy, but also in Scripture, is the reality of human freedom. And not just any kind of freedom, right? The kind of freedom at stake is what we call morally significant freedom. And what that means is we're not just free to choose between giving each other flowers or giving each other chocolates. We're free to choose between helping or harming each other. Richard Swinburne calls it, God giving us a part in his creative work, right? Giving us a hand in what kind of a creation we might live in. But in doing so, that does bring a degree of risk because then we are free and able to harm each other, and we do.
Yes. One of the people you quote is, of course, Dr. Alvin Plantinga. We've had him on here before, but I like to have people like you on because you talk to the rest of us, although he does a pretty good job. But 2 points that you make in this article are, first of all, that God judges significant human freedom to be a great good. And second, that significant human freedom cannot be had without suffering. And so that brings us to the issue of suffering, because some people might say, okay, I understand, you got to choose, but why couldn't God have created a world where you choose between, I don't know, different colors or different positive things, that rather than something that is truly evil that we have experienced so much in the 20th and 21st century?
Yeah, and that is a great question. And I think that typically, if you think about it just for a second, that sounds compelling. But if you let yourself really go further and imagine what that world would be like, it's a lot less compelling. Even when I teach at the University of South Florida, which is just a big state school. I don't think most of my students are Christians. I don't even know that most of them believe in God at all. But when we talk about this in the classroom, they pretty quickly start to believe that real, morally significant freedom is probably better than this sanitized world. And here's why. It's really hard to imagine meaningful human relationships where you never have to choose kindness, where you never have to choose to be a friend to someone, because that's the only thing available. I think all of us know, they'll raise the movie The Truman Show. If everybody around you is externally compelled, if everyone around you has no choice but to be your friend, then none of them is really your friend. And a world with friendship seems like a good kind of world to have.
Here's another aspect, and again, maybe because I'm a parent, now a grandparent, I see this, because some people say, well, why couldn't God just intervene? I know when, for example, some of my kids were better drivers than others, but I had one daughter that I said, we should maybe just actually allocate a teenage driver lane, and that is to have pads and pillows and barriers and everything so that they won't hurt themselves or anyone else. But what I found is that if you always interrupt a stupid decision that has been made by your child, if you always interrupt any kind of action, although I don't recommend that if they're standing on the top of your roof that you say, oh, I'll let them fall and find out what's going to happen. But we do recognize that there comes very quickly with this idea that we want God to intervene every single time, that leads to a high level of irresponsibility ultimately, doesn't it?
I think that it does, and I think that it also ultimately would lead to another kind of suffering. If every time you tried to exercise your choice in a way that God didn't want, he thwarted you, you would suffer. You would feel frustrated. You would feel angry. It might still be that, it will always be that God's choice is the better choice. But I don't actually think that would alleviate suffering. I think it would just make it a different kind of suffering.
And so, again, that's the kind of issue that we have to address, because you are really talking about a different kind of freedom. Let's get into that, because it's what you might refer to as a morally significant freedom, because that is one where you really have choices and where there is a relationship, a cause and effect between benefiting yourself and harming yourself, benefiting someone else or harming someone else. And so that additional word or two of morally significant freedom is really important in this argument, isn't it?
Yes, it's absolutely important. It's also important that it be, so there are two important things. First, that it be morally significant freedom. Also, that it be what philosophers call libertarian free will or incompatibilist freedom. The reason that this is relevant to the Christian conversation is it hinges a lot on your view of divine sovereignty. If you have a very, very strong view of divine sovereignty, where you really think that everything that's ever going to be done has totally been ordained by God, the free will defense gets more difficult to give. People who offer the free will defense think that we have robust free will, where that means that sometimes you really have more than one choice available to you, and you really could do either, again, without being thwarted by God, without violating the laws of nature, without going against what God has ordained, that you have real choices. And further, yes, that those choices are morally significant, that you have choices between helping and harming someone. Even outside of the question of God, in academic ethics or moral philosophy, there's a pretty strong presumption that if we don't have this kind of freedom, it's hard to make sense of moral responsibility. And think of it this way. We don't tend to praise or blame people for things that they did but couldn't have helped but done. The example I use in the classroom is if I'm out for a walk and I see a child that's about to get hit by a car, and I jump and I grab the child, people will praise me morally, will think that I did something good because I chose to save this child. But if I'm out for a walk and I trip and in falling, knock a child out of the path of an oncoming car, we may be very glad it happened. Everyone will be glad that the child has been saved, but no one is going to praise me for having done something good, because it isn't something that I chose to do. It isn't something that I did on purpose. It isn't what we call an action. It's just kind of a thing that happened, that my body was a part of. So morally significant freedom says we have that kind of freedom to choose to do good and helpful, morally praiseworthy things.
We are continuing our conversation with Dolores Morris. We'll continue that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes talking with Dr. Dolores Morris, and if you'd like to know more about her, we have the website for her as well as a link to the actually Facebook page and Twitter post and some other resources. I might also mention her book, Believing Philosophy, Becoming a Christian Philosopher, which, by the way, is at the very back of this article that we've posted from the Worldview Bulletin. So let me first of all encourage you to maybe have her come and speak for your group. Also, I would encourage you to subscribe to Worldview Bulletin. Of course, the December issue has her article, but of course you will find all sorts of other great resources. But Dr. Morris, for just a minute, while we're talking about when God would not intervene because we have free choice, it raises the other question that we've been discussing for the last couple of weeks. We had, I think it was 2 weeks ago, we had Craig Keener on to talk about his book on miracles. Last week we had J.P. Moreland on to talk talk about his book on miracles. And a while back, we had, of course, Lee Strobel to talk about the case for miracles. That raises some questions because, as you were saying before, we don't have complete freedom. So, first of all, it brings us to the idea that sometimes we will pray that God's will be done. We will pray that God will put a hedge around individuals. So it seems to me that though we agree with this idea of the free will defense, we also, if we believe, and we should, in God's sovereignty, can have the influence of prayer to prevent evil. Can you speak to that?
Oh, yes, I think absolutely. I think, again, you can read philosophers or you can go back to Scripture. It's pretty clear that sometimes God does directly act against a person's free will. He'll harden Pharaoh's heart, for example. So I do think there's no tension there. I think we can say that, well, how do you explain the presence of suffering in the world? It's just the natural consequence of God giving us this robust moral freedom. But that doesn't have to mean that we have carte blanche all the time, and that God therefore promises to never intervene and never thwart the free will of an individual.
So again, it certainly fits there. What about the place of miracles? Because we would, again, recognize that a miracle, I'm going to sound like David Hume for a minute, is a violation, if you will, of natural law. But again, we have all sorts of examples of the miracles in the Old Testament, the New Testament. Of course, Craig Keener wrote a 2-volume set talking about the fact that the miracles didn't stop after the Apostle John died. But though, how do we put that together with this idea of free will, God's sovereignty and everything? I know I'm asking a really big question, but see if you can help us out with that.
It is a big question. It's a tough question, but I think a lot of the answer comes down to the fact that we're talking about the author of these laws, right? So if a miracle is a violation against the law of nature, it's done by the author of the laws of nature. And I think that the creator has the creator's prerogative. I think, so I absolutely still believe in miracles. I don't think that they're just a thing of the past. Having trouble tying it to the free will defense specifically, except to say that, there wouldn't even be a place for miracles in a world without suffering.
Right.
And in addition to miracles are not the only or even the most common way that God acts in our world. One, I think, essential advantage that Christianity has in giving the free will defense, as opposed to just a bland theism that we believe in God, but not necessarily any specific religion, is that we have a God who chose to take on suffering with us.
Yes.
And I just think that strengthens the free will defense for Christianity so profoundly when you say, okay, so God chose to allow us to suffer because in his wisdom, he thought free will was worth it. But look, he went further and he put himself into that suffering and he took that suffering on himself, which is, again, a kind of love and a kind of relationship that a world without suffering wouldn't even leave room for. There would be no need for it. There would be no framework for it.
And again, that was the connection I was thinking, because he actually was willing to suffer. Number two, shortest verse in the New Testament, Jesus wept. Well, not only wept, but in a sense was angry. So this was not what was intended. And so I think that gets back to some of those questions about God and evil. But before we go, I did want to spend a moment or two talking about your book, because it is called Believing Philosophy, a Guide to Becoming a Christian Philosopher. It is about 270 pages, published by our friends at Zondervan, but you talk about what is philosophy, why should a Christian study philosophy, how should a Christian study philosophy. Then you get into these issues of the problem of evil, rationality and faith, free will, skepticism, and all the rest. And it seems to me that we each year are encouraging young people to be prepared for their university experience. Now, they might be privileged enough to actually enroll in a class with you at the University of South Florida, but by and large, most of the time, if they take a philosophy class, they're going to get one that's going to just indoctrinate them into atheism, because these arguments that are used oftentimes are ones that begin to erode away or even challenge Christian faith. And so I wanted people to know that your book is out. It is one that I think would be very helpful for individuals that want to study this, and it would be a great present maybe to get to a graduating senior so he or she knows that there are some answers to some of the questions they may hear in the classroom.
Well, thank you. Yes, I actually believe that philosophy is a really great discipline for the Christians, and that there's a surprising number of Christian academic philosophers. You're right that there is also, of course, a good number of atheistic philosophers. But what I love about philosophy that sets it apart from the other disciplines is that the question of whether or not God exists is an appropriate question for the classroom. In a lot of other classes, you just assume an atheistic worldview, and that's the expectation. You want to do anthropology, sociology, psychology. God isn't even allowed on the table for discussion, whereas in philosophy it is. So I wrote this book because, as you said, I just think Christians need to know that philosophy is not a discipline for the atheists, and that thinking carefully about our beliefs is something we should all do, and that because there are these Christian philosophers, it's better that the church know about them. And turn to them, right, when they do encounter this difficulty. Because if you are taking a philosophy class and you encounter a very smart atheist giving you arguments against the existence of God, your best hope for being able to understand that and respond to it is a Christian philosopher. And there just seems to be a gap between the Christian philosophical community and the church at large. So thank you for mentioning the book. I did write it in the hope of trying to bridge that gap.
Well, I think you've done a very good job. And again, we're not really familiar with you till we read your article in the Worldview Bulletin, which is another reason to subscribe to the Worldview Bulletin, but also a reason to go to your website because you have information there. It's DoloresGMorris.com. Don't have to remember all that because we have that right next to your picture, as well as we have a link to your Facebook page and Twitter posts and all sorts of other things. So thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to the next opportunity.
Great. Thank you, too. Take care.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, going to get into this issue of Christian nationalism, and we did that because on almost the same day, David French and our other guest, Ryan Sanders, wrote articles on the subject. I said, okay, it's worth a topic for an hour, and then we'll get back into, of course, other issues in the news. If you go to the website, of course, you'll see some of the things we've posted here today. I've already mentioned them, my Viewpoints commentary, our Take Action item, and our video, which you would probably appreciate. A wonderful story of two individuals, Will Ford and Matt Lockett, speaking on the issue of racial reconciliation, then discovering years later that Matt Lockett's great-great-grandparents actually were the slave owners of Will Ford's great-great-grandparents, and the story that unfolds from that, even more interesting. And again, it's a video we make available to you at the website at pointofview.net. We come back from the break, we'll get into this topic. It relates, of course, to the issue of church and state and how, as Christians, we think about this nation, how we think about the gospel, and a variety of other things. So we'll get into that in some detail. And if you'd like to join our conversation, I think this will be a rousing discussion. You are welcome to give us a call. That number is 800-351-1212. We'll take a break. We'll come back with that topic right after this.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic. I've recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Our topic this hour is the subject of Christian nationalism, and there's a couple of good reasons why we wanted to do this. First of all, on January 9th, an individual by the name of Ryan Sanders, you're going to have a chance to meet him in just a minute, wrote a piece, Here's Where Christian Nationalism Comes From and What It Gets Wrong, and it was appearing in the Dallas Morning News. And I read it and thought that might be another topic that we could come into. And that very same day, David French, who will also be with us, wrote a piece called A Nation of Christians is Not Necessarily a Christian Nation, and then followed up a couple of days later with a piece, America's Christian History is Broader Than Its White Protestant Past. And so those were some reasons to begin to cover that issue. And so I thought it would be appropriate enough, especially given the fact that what we also have is one of our booklets coming out, A Christian Perspective on Church and State. And one of the people we quote is Daniel Dreisbach, who Ryan Sanders quotes from. Also, when I was in church on Sunday, we all went out to lunch. I sit down and the woman next to me says, I got a question. I read this article by Ryan Sanders about Christian nationalism. I want to know what you thought about that. And I said, well, you might want to listen in on Thursday, because that's a topic that we will be addressing. And it, of course, is one that we've addressed before. We have posted a piece that David French wrote a year ago called Discerning the Difference Between Christian Nationalism and Christian Patriotism. But let me introduce our guest and kind of set forth the conversation. Ryan Sanders is an opinion journalist and is a member of the editorial board of the Dallas Morning News, has a bachelor's degree in journalism from Texas A&M, but also a master's in biblical and theological studies from Dallas Theological Seminary. So, Ryan, I appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, Kerry, thanks for having me.
Also, David French, certainly no stranger to Point of View. We quote from him often. He's been in studio and certainly by phone with us, senior editor of the Dispatch, graduate of Harvard Law School, former senior writer for National Review. And we, of course, talked about some of his books, including Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat, and How to Restore Our Nation. So, David, thank you for joining us as well.
Well, thanks for having me back. I appreciate it.
Always enjoy running into you. Did at the National Religious Broadcasters, and we'll be up in your area of the world in March, because they'll be taking place there in Nashville. But Ryan, for just a minute, explain why you decided to write that article. It's a very lengthy article. We've posted it on the website. People can read it in its entirety. But of all the issues you could be addressing, you wrote about Christian nationalism the same day that David French was writing about it. So what precipitated it? I think we know the answer, but go ahead.
Sure. Well, I mean, that weekend was the anniversary of the January 6th attacks, and I had been reading about this sort of rise of Christian nationalism and this movement in the years, 12 months since that day, because I, along with, other believers, I think were really confused and troubled and curious about what we saw on that day, and the Christian flags that were part of that charge, and the memorabilia that Jesus 2020, and just the sort of the overt Christian influence in that riot. And so I had been thinking about that for a long time. When the anniversary popped up, I pitched the idea of writing it to my editor, and he was kind enough to let me do it and go on for 3,500 words, as you said.
A little bit longer than the typical piece. David, let's come to you because we've talked about this before with you. We've talked about it with Rod Dreyer. Some people might say, haven't you talked about it enough? Well, obviously not. And so why, again, did you feel the need after writing, I think, a very good piece a year ago on the difference between Christian nationalism and Christian patriotism? Again, because of, I guess, January 6th, you felt the need to really talk about a different issue, and I think it's one that stimulated some back and forth, which I still notice is taking place. And that is this whole idea that a nation of Christians isn't necessarily a Christian nation. Explain that, if you might.
Yeah, so what this was rooted in was the impulse or the idea that a lot of the January 6th protesters shared, but well beyond the January 6th protesters, but what underlies a lot of the, a lot of the more radicalized edges of sort of the white evangelical Christian community and its political engagement is this idea that America is or has been a Christian nation, and that its fundamental Christian identity is being lost. And so that lends that incredible, almost existential urgency to some of the actions that took place to defend Donald Trump, because they viewed Donald Trump, interestingly enough, as sort of the last bulwark, the last bastion against the collapse of America as a Christian nation. And so what I wanted to do in my piece is just ask, what is a Christian nation? Is it a Christian nation defined by the fact that most of the members of the community are Christian? Is that what makes it a Christian nation? Or does there have to be something more, sort of an underlying commitment to justice and mercy, for example? And what I tried to explain was a lot of this sort of longing for an idealized past is not appropriate. It's a fictionalized version of the American past, and that in fact, in many ways, America is becoming a more just nation, and has become a more just nation in recent years. And sort of this longing for an idealized Christian past is wholly inappropriate and is in fact dangerous, because they're longing for a past where America was less just, in fact, and America in many ways by its institutional actions was less Christian.
Yeah, and again, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area and Berkeley, and I have to think of the individuals who were older than I am that went to March in Selma. One was a Sunday school leader, but that was in a Sunday school class that I attended for a while in Berkeley, which was probably the most liberal church in the San Francisco Bay Area. And our neighbors who were atheists and weren't Christian at all. So in some respects, during that same period of time when you had Jim Crow and you had segregation and all the rest, as you've pointed out in your piece, sometimes you weren't exactly getting the Southern Baptist Convention to speak out against those issues. So that is one kind of premise of your article. But I thought we'd come to Ryan for just a minute, because you gave us a little bit of a history lesson. Where did this come from? And a lot of that goes back to the Puritans and the city set on a hill and those kinds of ideas. So we need to take a break. When we come back, Ryan, I thought maybe we'd have you give us a little of that background. And also, then we might modernize it, because if you think about it, during the 1950s and 60s, we've talked about this with, he's no longer alive, Professor Richard Perard and others, that we had kind of an American civil religion at the time. So these ideas, as you point out, aren't necessarily new. That's part of your article. Where do they come from? Then we'll talk about where it gets wrong. But most importantly, what can we do to maybe clarify what we teach from this broadcast, from pulpits in America and other places, to maybe address some of those issues. So we've got a lot to cover. It's the topic of Christian nationalism. If you find yourself saying, okay, I really want to read these articles, the one by Ryan Sanders, where Christian nationalism comes from and what it gets wrong, was published by Dallas Morning News, and I think you should be able to get it. Of course, I have a subscription, so it was easy for me to read, but we can make it available to you. And then the one on Christian nationalism and Christian patriotism is one of many articles from what's called the French Press or the Dispatch. And again, I have a subscription to that, but if you want to read those, I think we have enough there for you to be able to get a pretty good sense of what they are communicating. And we'll come back and talk about, where did this come from? What's the history? We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This country had a crime spike in 2021. The only real question is whether it will continue in 2022. Social commentators remind us that once law and order is lost, it is not easy to restore. How bad was this crime spike? The Uniform Crime Report details a rise in murders of around 29%. A dozen U.S. cities set homicide records: Tucson, Arizona; Columbus, Ohio; Toledo, Ohio; Rochester, New York; Philadelphia, Pennsylvania; Indianapolis, Indiana; Louisville, Kentucky; St. Paul, Minnesota; Portland, Oregon; Baton Rouge, Louisiana; Austin, Texas; and Albuquerque, New Mexico. Some of these cities are a surprise, but Portland and St. Paul, Minnesota are not. These are places in the country where the city leaders called for defunding the police and then went ahead and did just that. Mayors in some of these cities who originally talked about defunding the police have now quietly decided to restore funding. Of course, homicide isn't the only crime statistic on the way up. YouTube is full of videos of criminals breaking into stores and running off with stolen goods. Some of the videos show criminals in stores casually walking through the store, picking up items and walking out. Store owners have tried to stop this rash of smash and grab by posting security, but you can see videos where they don't try too hard to stop the pillaging since they don't want to get hurt. Law enforcement is also experiencing what has been called the Minneapolis effect. Proactive policing is declining because so many of the anti-police protests. Arrests are down and crime went up. As much as we would hope 2022 would be better than 2021, these trends won't be easily reversed. We may see a continued crime wave before it can be stopped. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again talking about Christian nationalism. We'll get back to the news probably tomorrow. I suspect we'll be quoting from David French on why Ukraine matters tomorrow, but we'll get into those issues tomorrow. There'll certainly be time to cover some of those issues. And of course, we've been talking about the Beijing Olympics and Uyghurs and all sorts of other issues that will certainly be part of that news. But I thought today, since we have this opportunity to have two individuals that have addressed this issue of Christian nationalism, we might do so. Ryan Sanders with us, David French. And Ryan, I set you up to maybe give us a little bit of a history lesson, if you would mind, because these ideas really go back to essentially the 17th century, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, even the earliest settlers, even before America was a nation, right, the earliest European settlers on this continent were followers of Jesus and was even explicit about their desire to sort of form an exclusively Protestant enclave there. I think that idea sort of changed by the time we got to the founding documents, but there's certainly that desire throughout American history that there's this desire among Christians to have a sort of comfortable Christian preeminence in the culture of the nation. And it's, I quoted a pastor named Ebenezer Baldwin from the colonial era. Even the United States Supreme Court in 1892 declared this is a Christian nation in a case that had to do with cultural expressions of Christianity. They pointed out that in God we trust is on our money, federal buildings are closed on Sundays, like in all these sort of cultural ways, the Christian influence is seen throughout our history. But I think I'm glad the way that you set that up in just a minute ago before the break was to say, now that we have that heritage, what should we do with it, and what should we do now? And I think that's a different question.
David, let me come to you, because obviously you have to walk through a lot of minefields, because on the one hand, I know you don't want to say this is a Christian nation, but on the other hand, you are a First Amendment lawyer that has identified and defended Christian ideas and principles and the right of not only Christians, but anybody that has a religious expression in the public arena. So it's a difficult line to walk, but it's one that you've had to do almost every day.
Well, I think whether or not you call this a Christian nation, there's absolutely no question that religious liberty is a fundamental constitutional guarantee. And so there's no inconsistency between saying that this is not a Christian nation in any sort of formal legal sense, yet at the same time, or with anything remotely approaching an established church or anything that looks like an established church, while also saying that Christians enjoy equal rights to all other faiths in the practice of their religion, and that the practice of religion of all faiths should be broadly protected. And so that's that argument. I don't think there's anything inconsistent with making those two arguments. That, in fact, those two arguments are key to American pluralism, to the very existence of this nation. How do you knit together a nation made up of people from competing faith traditions? And lest we think Christians are a monolithic faith tradition, let's not forget that Christians have proven entirely capable of killing each other at scale in wars of religion, for example, or more even, somewhat more recently in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. That the unity, that the religious liberty and the relative peace between American Christian denominations is by itself something of a miracle. And so that commitment to pluralism that says all faiths enjoy equal liberty at the same time that no faith has formal primacy, it's sort of a fundamental part of our American social compact.
And I think part of that is education. I know that back in the 1980s, when we talked about the Equal Access Act, because I had been involved in speaking at University of Missouri, Kansas City, there was a case, the Mergens case, which you're familiar with, went all the way there. And we started talking about the fact that if you're going to have a chess club or a ski club or whatever after hours, then you could have a Bible club. But then I began to say, but that also means that you could have a Hindu club or a Buddhist club or whatever.
Right.
And I would sometimes have people call in and saying, well, I don't want that. And I said, no, if you're going to have freedom for one, it's freedom for all. I don't get those phone calls so much anymore. So I think part of that's education. And when we've had Kelly Shackelford on almost every week, he's on, or else one of his people from First Liberty, we talk about the fact that they will actually defend any religious group. I know you will as well. So maybe part of that is just the education that could take place right here on a radio program.
Oh, that's absolutely right. And one of the things that, as you said, the free exercise clause and our First Amendment rights more broadly are equally enjoyed by every faith tradition, every ideology, and every person in the United States of America. And so, in a very real way, and I've defended the religious liberty of Muslims, of Jews, of the free speech rights of atheists, of people across the spectrum. And when one religious group wins in a religious liberty case, all religions in a very real and profound way win as well. When you expand the sphere of liberty for one, you expand the sphere of liberty for all. And in fact, if you look at religious liberty case law, you'll often see Christians relying on cases that protected Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses relying on cases that protected Native Americans. It's a symbiotic relationship in the world of religious liberty litigation. And so that's something I think an increasing number of Americans have appreciated, but there's also still a backlash. There's a backlash on the far left and the far right, with some folks on the far right wanting the First Amendment really to primarily protect Christian liberty, and some folks on the far left really in many ways denigrating the entire concept of religious liberty to a more subordinate place in American law.
Let me, if I can, Ryan, come to you, because one of the people you quote is Glenn Kreider, professor at Dallas Seminary. He's been in the studio with us many times before, but he's arguing that maybe sometimes this is a reaction to some of the things that have been taking place.
Yeah, well, he and I think, agree, and I think maybe the three of us on this call might agree, too, that there's this sense among many, certainly among Christian nationalists, but I think even more broadly than that, among a lot of sort of conservative evangelical Christians, that we've suffered some sort of cultural loss. And I really appreciate, David, your comments a little bit ago that it depends on what lens we look through. If we look through the equity lens, then maybe America is living up to our Christian ideals even more now than we did a generation or two ago. But there's this sense among some that on issues like abortion or gay marriage or prayer in schools, you name it, that we've sort of stepped away from these Christian morals culturally, and that we've suffered this cultural loss. And what Dr. Kreider called that this rise of Christian nationalism, the dying gasp of our privilege. And he's saying that we've so become used to cultural hegemony, cultural dominance in the sort of religious expression sphere. That's not to say legal dominance, that other religions were outlawed, but, we sort of defaulted to the Christian cultural norms, Christmas and Easter and holidays and, whatever. And if that is going away, it's only natural to suspect that that Christians are going to sort of convulse in response and be like, oh, I don't want that to go away. I don't want to lose my place of privilege in the cultural sort of atmosphere. And so that's what he said. He called this a sort of a convulse in response to this sense of cultural loss. And I think that's right.
And he also reminds us, and I think that's something we would all agree, that if I can use your quote from there, church has never been in charge of the world in which it lives. If anything, we've always been sort of a minority voice, but I would also at least add from a positive point of view, if you look at most of the really successful social movements, the abolition movement, the suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, those all rested on a Christian base. The people now that are suggesting we need to adopt some kind of Marxist view, some kind of critical theory view, really, first of all, hasn't worked, because you need to have some belief in right and wrong, standards of right and wrong, all sorts of other issues. So I want to take a break and maybe then come back and talk about, well, then what can we do? I have a lot of pastors and Christian leaders listening to this broadcast that might say, okay, you've identified an issue, and is it something we should talk about? How do we talk about it? And most importantly, back to some of the arguments, if indeed we know where it came from, how does it necessarily get it wrong? And what if we can maybe make a distinction between Christian nationalism, which we've identified, and the value of Christian patriotism, which is, of course, the piece that David French wrote a year ago, as well as some of the others that are there. So we have all sorts of articles that you will probably want to read if this is an issue for you and maybe something you'd like to teach on or interact on. And, of course, we also have all sorts of other resources there as well. I might point you to our video, which is the interview that we did 2 years ago with Will Ford and Matt Lockett. They met 17 years ago on Martin Luther King Day. We had him on, both of them on Monday to give us an update. Incredible story of, indeed, Matt Lockett's great-great-grandparents, it turns out, were the slave holders of Will Ford's great-great-grandparents. And yet this African-American, Anglo-American, having spoken on racial reconciliation, used that as a great forum and platform to speak to some of these issues. So that video is available, and all these articles we're in are available, and we'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Ryan Sanders and David French. And if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. And I thought, Ryan, maybe I'd come to you for just a minute because you have a theological degree. You've been ordained, and maybe you can speak to some pastors in this regard, because I would suspect some are listening saying, well, okay, what should be the difference in how I address some of these issues from the pulpit? How do I teach a Sunday school class? Obviously, I want to make a distinction between Israel in the Old Testament and the United States, but can you give us some ideas? Because in your article, you talk about what we get wrong, but maybe we could talk about how to make it right.
Absolutely. And I think, any Christian leader listening to this is facing those questions, daily or at least weekly. I know I was. And how are we to understand America's place in God's plan? And we are not Israel. We don't have a covenant with God like Israel did from Deuteronomy 28 or from Genesis 12 or, any of the covenants of the Old Testament. So how do we understand our place? And briefly, I think there's two big ideas, and that is we have to learn to live like missionaries and we have to learn to live like exiles. The whole point of a missionary is to live among people who don't share their worldview, right? And I like what Ed Stetzer says. He says the church has to learn how to start playing without home field advantage. And if there is this sense of cultural loss, our most unhealthy response would be to try to seize political power to retake that cultural loss. The most spiritual and countercultural response would be, how do we live like missionaries? So what if the thing that God is doing in American history right now is not actually judgment? It's opening a door for the church to have less power, but be more faithful to her calling. And I wonder if that's even an invitation that we would want to say yes to. What if being more faithful to our calling actually meant giving up power and privilege? So I think we have to learn to live as missionaries. I think the lie that much of the American church has believed is that you can be a Christian without being a missionary. And there is, in the biblical understanding, we serve a sent and sending God. That language might sound familiar to some of your listeners. God is always sending out, and to follow him means to be sent. So I think we have to learn to live as missionaries, and I think we have to learn to live as exiles. I don't think that we should expect the culture around us to always affirm our values. That's kind of the point of living as a missionary. When I wrote that piece, the next week I got an email from a missionary in Central Africa, and he said, I was so glad to read that. I don't know how the Dallas Morning News made it all the way to Africa, but he said, I was so glad to read that because he said, I feel like the rest of us in the global church are watching this happen in America and going, what is the American church thinking? The rise of Christian nationalism doesn't sort of align with the values of the church who's used to living as missionaries and living as exiles. And the New Testament never imagines Christians, like Dr. Kreider said in that quote, the New Testament never imagines Christians as Caesar, right? That would have been completely out of Paul's imagination. And so all those passages about obeying the authorities in charge, or even when Jesus was offered the opportunity to seize political and military control, and all of those sort of imagine the church, like Dr. Kreider said, as a minority voice, a prophetic voice. Those movements that you just mentioned, Kerby, about abolitionist movements and civil rights movements, those were all prophetic voices speaking truth to power, but they weren't in power. They were the conscience of the culture,
That's right.
Not in charge of the culture. And when those roles get reversed, things get wacky.
Gets back to the church-state issues. Again, the sword, if you will, of the church is not a sword. It's the moral influence. And that sets up, of course, the conversation with David French, because oftentimes what we are doing, whether it's in a court of law that you are doing that, or in your column, is to use moral persuasion and to use arguments of common grace. So talk about what we could do to maybe rectify some of the issues you've identified in some of the articles you've written.
Yeah, one of the things we have to do is we have to remember, at first, we don't have reason to face the future with fear. This is a thing about Paul writing, God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and of sound mind. And when was he writing that? He was writing that in a time when persecution was orders of magnitude more severe than it is today. And he was writing at a time when the church was orders of magnitude smaller and weaker than it is today. And even then he was saying, do not have a spirit of fear. And yet all around me, I see the spirit of fear. We all see the spirit of fear. In fact, it's the spirit of fear that in many ways is the animating spirit of politics. And it seems a little incongruent for the followers of the living God, the creator of the heavens and the earth, and the followers of Jesus who conquered death and hell, to face the future with fear. And yet you see it time and time again. And so I think the first sort of message to the church is fear not. And then the second message is perhaps we were too comfortable. Perhaps we were too comfortable and wrongly comfortable. You know, again, this gets to the point where I was making in my piece about our nation's Christian tradition. The past was not as righteous as we remember. The church was not as virtuous in the past as we remember. And these were not golden days of Christian justice in American past, even though they might have been golden days of Christian power. And Christian power does not always yield justice. Just to take the most stark example imaginable, it was white Christians who were attacking black Christians with dogs and fire hoses in the South in the 1950s and 1960s. That was the Bible Belt where that was happening. The most religious region of the United States of America was also for generations an apartheid state. And so when you look at it from that perspective, we cannot look at the past and say that Christian power and just putting more Christians in power is always going to yield a good result. That is not always the case. So we have to approach the public square with humility. We have to approach the public square with respect for the rights of others. And these are the kind, and that's the kind of attitude that all too often has been lacking. There's been much more of an attitude that says, if we are in charge, we will set all things right. And the rest of America looks at us and says, oh, you've been in charge. and
it didn't go so well.
And in many ways, it didn't go as well as you promised that it'll go. And so we have to have an extreme amount of humility as we approach the public square, and to do it without fear. We do serve the creator of the heavens of the earth. We do serve a Jesus who conquered death and hell. And so what do we have to fear from an opposing political party or from a city or state government? And that doesn't mean that you just allow your rights to be trampled. We have ample opportunity to defend ourselves in court, more so than virtually any Christian generation that's ever preceded us in the whole history of humanity. Yes, absolutely defend your liberties and in a respectful and in a lawful manner, but to fear the future the way so many folks do, no.
Well, again, I was just thinking of some of the words we use around this table. One of those, of course, is the need for discernment. Like, how do I believe anymore because of so many statements? But also courage. You know, when we've had Rod Dreyer on about live not by lies, we recognize that some of the things that were happening behind the Iron Curtain seem to be happening here. But then the other word we use all the time is humility. So you've actually talked about courage in the midst of fear and humility. I'll just add discernment to that as well. And those are some really important, if you will, action items. We need to take a break. When we come back, maybe, David, you could help us real quickly with this idea of Christian nationalism versus Christian patriotism, because some people might listening and think, well, that means I can never put my hand over my heart. I can never sing God Bless America. That's not what you're meaning at all. I understand that. But at the same time, I think these discussions, if they could be helpful, will help us understand the real need to know what to do next. I was just at a funeral, and one of the people that I shook hands with as a pastor who was just down the road a little bit, and he years ago said, well, I'm confused, and I'm afraid my congregation is sometimes confused. So he made the radical statement of, I'm going to remove our American flag from the sanctuary. And I found out about that. And then a couple of years later, when I was actually speaking to a youth group there, I was looking for a podium. I go in the back, and there's that flag still sitting there in the storage room. So there are some that are saying, well, is that what I need to do? We can no longer have a 4th of July celebration in the church. How do we react to some of that? So we'll take a break and just get a couple other creative ideas, both from David French and, of course, also from Ryan Sanders. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to read a little bit more about what they are saying, that is certainly good. If I can also promote the fact that the Dispatch is a great place to find so many of these articles, including, of course, the articles by David French. Those are available as well, and you can click on the pictures of these two individuals so that you can find out a little bit more. And, of course, if you go there, you'll see that we have some information about Ryan Sanders if you'd like to correspond with him and learn more about him. We also, of course, have a link to thedispatch.com, which will get you to the French press. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation for a few more minutes right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just, as a program note, mention that tomorrow we will get back into foreign policy issues for just a little while because, again, the White House believes that Russia might actually invade Ukraine, so we're going to talk about that, obviously. We've talked about the filibuster. Matter of fact, that's our action item there for you. And Senator Mark Kelly has decided to go along with Chuck Schumer. Of course, his other colleague there in Arizona, Christian Nationalism, does not go along with that, nor does Joe Manchin. So we'll get into those issues. Second hour, we're going to get into some of the economic issues. Washington cashes in on inflation. What about the Federal Reserve? We're going to be talking about debt and a variety of other topics. So lots that we will cover tomorrow. But just before we wind down, Ryan, let me come to you. Former pastor, you've got to be thinking a little bit about what a pastor listening to this might say. What does that mean can we still sing God Bless America? Can we have a Pledge of Allegiance sometimes at a Boy Scout event at the church? Should we have a flag? I mean, these are some questions that I know people legitimately are asking, and some have come to different answers, and I think that's up to the individual congregation. But can you give us some guidelines on what you would suggest?
Yeah, one of my favorite professors, not Dr. Kreider, but another professor at DTS this week tweeted that if your worship service wouldn't make sense in another location in the global church, if the worship service at my church wouldn't make sense in the church of that missionary that emailed me from Niger, then maybe I've skewed the God. Maybe I'm worshiping a God that looks a little different, right? So, I would not say this might help. Here's a really simple scenario. We don't have a flag in the church, in the sanctuary at the church where I worship. I think that's a good practice. But last year we hosted a blood drive on Memorial Day, and that was not in the sanctuary where, you know, the Eucharist happens, where worship happens. It was not on a Sunday, and it was on a cultural holiday. It was on Memorial Day when we're meant to remember those who have given their lives for our freedom, right? So I was in favor of putting flags out on the church lawn to sort of mark, you know, as people came in, that as a sort of cultural holiday. I'm not in favor of flags in the altar space, right? The worship, conflating the liturgy with patriotism. That's where I wouldn't want. So maybe those two scenarios give you kind of an idea of where I draw that line, but every pastor is going to have to figure that out, I think, how they navigate that.
Yes, again, I go to churches that do both. So again, I think there's a part of common grace in allowing that. But it brings us back, David French, to maybe discerning the differences between Christian nationalism and Christian patriotism, because I think some people are saying, can't I support this country? You've worked in the military. You have served with distinguished valor in all of that. So again, you were a veteran of Iraqi freedom. So talk about that, if you might.
Yeah, so this is a really, and you know, there's actually a lot of wisdom on this point from C.S. Lewis. In the book Four Loves, he kind of lays out a framework for thinking about the love of your country, and he notes first that there is this very simple love of home, as he puts it, of the place where we grew up and the places that have been our homes, and so it's a very natural human affection for. It's simply where you live and your community, including your national community. And one of the things he notes about this very natural affection of our neighborhood, of our community, of our nation, is that patriotism of this kind is not, and I'm quoting him, the least aggressive. It asks only to be let alone. It becomes militant only to protect what it loves. In any mind which has a pennyworth of imagination, it produces a good attitude towards foreigners. How can I love my home without coming to realize that other men no less rightly love theirs? And that's a very natural and in many ways wholesome kind of affection that we have for our own community. But then he talks about the loves that can become much more toxic. And he talks about a particular attitude to your country's past where you minimize the actual history, which is often includes shabby and shameful doings right alongside the heroic stories, and emphasizes the heroic stories to the exclusion of the rest, which gives you a false impression of your own country. And then there's this most dangerous permutation that Lewis talked about, which he called the firm, even prosaic belief that our own nation in sober fact has long been and still is markedly superior to all others. In other words, this puts the nation at the center of the world and at the center, sometimes sadly, of God's plans in your mind. And Lewis, talked about how that can, on the fringe, lead into kinds of behaviors that we've seen in recent years here in the United States of America. And so there's a very large difference between that natural affection you feel for your home and the sense of superiority or centrality in the sweep of history and in God's plan that can become incredibly dangerous.
And again, you have a good quote from John Piper quoting C.S. Lewis's Four Loves, and a very extended quote. So again, that article is available and it gives you some ideas. But first of all, I want to just say thank you for both of you. I know that you have written about this. I don't know if you even know each other, but when both those articles showed up on the same day, I thought if we could put this together as a conversation, it would be great. I was hoping to get Ryan in studio here, but I wanted to be careful with COVID and everything, so he's by phone. And I just want to say, both of you, thank you for writing about this, and thank you for giving us an hour today. I know you're both busy and you're not looking for more to do, but I appreciate you giving us some time today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much.
I appreciate the invitation, and yes, I'll solicit prayers from your listeners. My daughter has COVID, but she seems to be doing fine. We appreciate the prayers, and I do appreciate the time and getting to talk with you guys. I really enjoyed it.
Okay. Let me mention real quickly, Ryan Sanders, opinion journalist and member of the editorial board of the Dallas Morning News. Of course, David French, senior editor of the Dispatch. Some great resources that I would encourage you to get available, and we thought we would have that conversation. Again, I don't know how often this idea of Christian nationalism shows up, but when you have some really smart people writing about it on the same day, I figured it was worth a coverage. And of course, it gets back to one of the booklets. If you are not one of the donors to Point of View, we send these booklets out to those of you that qualify, and it really only requires that you become part of the Truth Team. This is the most recent one I'm holding up right now on church state. After all, it's a topic we get into all the time, and I try to give you a little bit of history and some other resources which I think would be helpful for you if you wanted to understand this issue. Because how many times have you run into, I know I have, people saying, you can't have a creche in the public park because separation of church and state. You can't have a prayer at an inauguration ceremony because separation of church and state. And you say, okay, how do I respond to that? And my argument is that you don't want to read a book, but you wouldn't mind taking 10 minutes and reading one of our booklets. And so that's one of the resources we make available to you. The one before that was, of course, the one on God and Science. And that was one I mentioned yesterday because of our conversation about that Science and Faith Conference, which is taking place in Denton Bible Church, and you can find out more on the website. Just before we finish, let me mention, first of all, the video that we have been talking about, Will Ford and Matt Lockett. The Take Action, we are going to be talking about this tomorrow again in terms of the filibuster, because all of a sudden you thought that Senator from Arizona, that both senators, I guess is a better way to say it, would be against the filibuster. One is for it, one is not for changing it, and so that's going to be a little closer to a possible vote. So we're going to see what that means tomorrow. Of course, we have some real significant tensions on the border between Russia and Ukraine. We'll talk about that, and we'll get into some issues. And my Viewpoints commentary today is called Crime Spike. Isn't it interesting? The various cities that have had the highest rates of homicide, almost all of them, not all, but most of them, had defund the police kind of protests. And that has an impact, doesn't it? Well, that's all we have for today here on a Wednesday. I hope you'll join us tomorrow. I want to thank Andrew for his help as an engineer, Steve for his help as a producer, and for him pulling this all together for us today. Hope you will have a great day. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.